In May 1940, as Nazi Germany tore through Western Europe with breathtaking speed, Britain stood on the edge of catastrophe. France was collapsing, the British Expeditionary Force was trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, and invasion no longer seemed like a distant threat, but an approaching certainty. It was in this moment, before victory speeches and iconic soundbites, that Winston Churchill prepared the words meant for Britain's darkest hour. This was not a speech promising triumph. It was a speech designed for survival in the face of possible defeat. Behind closed doors, Churchill faced a reality far grimmer than the public understood. Britain's army risked annihilation or capture, its allies were falling one by one, and the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force stood as the final barriers between the island and occupation. While later history would frame this period as the beginning of Britain's finest hour, those living through it knew that failure was not only possible, but likely. Churchill's task was not to predict victory. It was to prepare a nation psychologically for a war it might lose, and to do so without allowing fear to break its will. Inside the war cabinet, pressure mounted relentlessly. Several senior figures believed Britain could not continue the fight alone and urged Churchill to explore peace negotiations with Adolf Hitler, using Benito Mussolini as an intermediary. The argument was brutally pragmatic. Preserve the empire, avoid invasion, save what could still be saved. Churchill listened, but he understood the cost of compromise. Any peace with Hitler would leave Britain humiliated, disarmed, and vulnerable, its future decided by a regime that had already shown it honored no agreements. Yet rejecting negotiation meant embracing the possibility of destruction. It meant risking invasion, aerial bombardment, starvation by blockade, and years of isolation. Churchill knew that if Britain chose resistance, it would have to do so with open eyes. The speech he prepared was meant to remove illusion. It did not promise safety, it promised struggle. It framed endurance itself as victory, even if defeat followed. In doing so, Churchill sought to redefine success. Britain might be conquered, but it would not surrender its identity or its choice. The words Churchill shaped during this crisis were forged in an atmosphere of profound uncertainty. Evacuation from Dunkirk was still underway, and no one knew whether the army would escape or be destroyed. The Royal Air Force was outnumbered, its pilots exhausted, its aircraft stretched thin. German air power loomed just across the Channel. Churchill understood that morale, not numbers, would decide whether Britain continued to fight. If fear took hold, political collapse would follow military pressure. His speech therefore aimed not to comfort, but to steel the public for hardship. It acknowledged suffering as inevitable. It treated resistance as a moral obligation rather than a calculation of odds. This approach was deliberate. Churchill believed that people could endure almost anything if they were told the truth and given a cause larger than survival. Britain's darkest hour, as he saw it, was not defined by bombs or armies, but by the temptation to choose safety over dignity. What makes this moment so extraordinary is how close Britain came to choosing a different path. Churchill was not speaking from a position of unanimous support. He was nearly isolated within his own government, arguing against compromise while defeat seemed rational. The speech he prepared was not merely rhetoric. It was a line drawn in advance, a statement of intent before events could force retreat. By preparing Britain for its darkest hour, Churchill removed fear as a bargaining chip. If the nation accepted suffering as the price of resistance, then the logic of surrender collapsed. The speech did not guarantee victory. It made defeat irrelevant to the decision to fight. In that sense, it was one of the most consequential acts of leadership in the war, delivered not with certainty, but with an unflinching acceptance of what lay ahead. The crisis that shaped Churchill's speech unfolded over a series of tense war cabinet meetings in late May 1940, when Britain's future was debated behind closed doors. As German forces advanced relentlessly and news from Dunkirk remained uncertain, key members of the cabinet began to question whether continued resistance was realistic. Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax argued that Britain should explore peace terms through Italy while it still possessed leverage. His position was not driven by sympathy for Hitler, but by fear of national annihilation. With France collapsing and the British army possibly lost, Halifax believed negotiation might preserve Britain's independence and empire. Churchill understood the logic of the argument, but he also saw its fatal flaw. Any peace negotiated under duress would leave Britain strategically helpless, bound by terms dictated by a regime that had already violated every agreement it had signed. Accepting such a settlement would not end the war. It would merely postpone Britain's destruction. The speech Churchill prepared was born from this realization. It was intended not only for the public, but as a declaration of resolve that would make negotiation politically and morally impossible. Churchill's leadership during these meetings was not theatrical or bombastic. It was deliberate and calculated. He allowed dissenting voices to speak, but he steadily reframed the discussion away from fear and toward consequences. Peace, he argued, would not spare Britain from suffering. It would guarantee it. Occupation, disarmament, and subjugation would follow, even if they arrived without immediate bloodshed. Resistance, by contrast, preserved agency. Britain might lose, but it would lose fighting, not pleading. This distinction lay at the heart of the speech Churchill prepared. It did not deny the dangers ahead. It named them plainly. Invasion was possible. Bombing was inevitable. Supplies would be strained. Allies were gone. Yet the speech transformed these realities into reasons to endure rather than surrender. By articulating the worst-case scenario openly, Churchill stripped it of its power to paralyze decision-making. At the same time, events at Dunkirk began to alter the psychological balance. Against all expectations, the evacuation gathered momentum. Thousands of soldiers were pulled from the beaches by naval vessels, merchant ships, and civilian boats. The operation was far from complete, and catastrophe still loomed. But the possibility of survival emerged where none had existed before. Churchill monitored these developments closely, adjusting his tone but not his premise. The speech remained grounded in uncertainty. Even if the army escaped, Britain would still stand alone. The reprieve at Dunkirk did not erase the strategic imbalance. German forces remained dominant on the continent, and Britain's defenses were stretched to their limits. Churchill understood that premature optimism could be as dangerous as despair. His words needed to prepare the nation not for immediate relief, but for prolonged struggle. The darkest hour was not a single moment. It was a period that could last months or years. This tension between fragile hope and brutal realism shaped the final form of Churchill's message. Rather than presenting evacuation as salvation, he framed it as a chance to continue the fight. Rather than promising protection, he promised perseverance. The speech drew its power from refusing to soften reality. Churchill believed that morale built on illusion would collapse at the first shock. Only honesty could sustain resistance when conditions worsened. By the time he delivered his words to Parliament and the nation, the immediate danger had not passed, but the choice had been made. Britain would not negotiate, it would not submit. The speech prepared the country to face its darkest hour, not with confidence of victory, but with acceptance of sacrifice. In doing so, it transformed fear into resolve and uncertainty into purpose, laying the foundation for Britain's survival at the moment when history could have turned in a very different direction. When Churchill finally addressed Parliament and the nation, the speech carried the weight of decisions already made in private. It was delivered at a moment when relief from Dunkirk was still incomplete, and the threat of invasion loomed just across the Channel. Churchill chose his words carefully, not to celebrate rescue, but to define what survival would demand next. He spoke of beaches, fields, streets, and hills not as rhetorical flourishes, but as a map of resistance. The message was unmistakable. Britain would fight everywhere because there would be nowhere left to retreat. This was not bravado. It was preparation. Churchill understood that if invasion came, the psychological battle would be fought before the physical one. The speech framed resistance as inevitable and universal, removing the expectation that safety or compromise remained an option. By doing so, it denied fear a place to settle. The darkest hour was not presented as a temporary crisis, but as a condition that Britain must endure with discipline and resolve. What made the speech extraordinary was how it balanced honesty with defiance. Churchill did not pretend that Britain was strong. He acknowledged isolation, danger, and sacrifice. Yet he refused to define strength in terms of numbers or immediate advantage. Strength, he argued implicitly, came from will. This reframing mattered. Military reality favored Germany in the summer of 1940, but political reality did not have to. By committing publicly to resistance, Churchill closed the door on negotiation not only with Hitler, but within Britain itself. Any future attempt to seek peace would now contradict the nation's declared intent. The speech therefore functioned as a strategic lock. Once spoken, Britain could not easily reverse course without betraying its own words. Churchill was fully aware of this. He accepted that by preparing the nation for its darkest hour, he was also binding himself to the consequences of that choice. The impact of the speech was immediate and profound. In Parliament, it silenced doubts that had lingered during the War Cabinet crisis. Among the public, it transformed anxiety into grim determination. There was no illusion that suffering had ended. Air raids were expected, invasion drills continued, yet the uncertainty that had paralyzed decision-making in May began to harden into resolve. Britain did not become fearless. It became committed. That distinction mattered. Fear acknowledged could be managed. Fear denied could not. Churchill's words gave shape to what endurance would look like, and in doing so, they provided a psychological framework for the months ahead. When the Battle of Britain began soon after, civilians and pilots alike understood that retreat was no longer a subject for debate. The speech had removed that option from the national vocabulary. In retrospect, the speech prepared Britain not just for military danger, but for moral isolation. Churchill made it clear that Britain might stand alone for a long time, perhaps indefinitely. He offered no guarantees of rescue from the United States or decisive intervention from elsewhere. This honesty strengthened credibility. When later appeals for support were made, they rested on a foundation of proven resolve rather than desperation. The darkest hour speech thus became more than wartime rhetoric. It was a declaration of identity. Britain would define itself by resistance, not by outcome. Victory would be welcomed, but it was not the condition for fighting. By setting that standard, Churchill ensured that even in defeat, Britain would not be broken politically or psychologically. The speech did not win the war, but it ensured that Britain remained in it at the moment when withdrawal was both tempting and seemingly rational. That choice, once made and spoken aloud, reshaped the course of the conflict and made later victory possible. As the summer of 1940 unfolded, the true purpose of Churchill's speech became fully apparent. It was not merely a reaction to crisis, but a preemptive act of leadership designed to shape how Britain would endure the months ahead. When the Battle of Britain began and German bombers crossed the Channel in waves, the nation entered the very ordeal Churchill had prepared it for. Cities were attacked, civilians were killed, and the threat of invasion remained real. Yet the psychological collapse many feared never came. The speech had already recalibrated expectations. Britons did not wait for reassurance that danger would pass quickly. They had been told, plainly, that hardship was inevitable. This honesty removed the shock from suffering. The darkest hour had been named before it fully arrived, and that naming gave people a framework to endure it. Churchill's words also served a strategic function beyond morale. By committing Britain publicly to total resistance, he sent an unmistakable signal to both enemies and potential allies. To Germany, the message was that intimidation would not force capitulation. Bombing cities would not break political will. To the United States, still officially neutral, it demonstrated that Britain was not seeking rescue, but was determined to fight regardless of cost. This mattered deeply. American leaders were more likely to support a nation that showed resolve than one that appeared on the verge of surrender. Churchill understood this dynamic instinctively. His speech did not ask for help. It proved Britain was worth helping. In doing so, it laid the groundwork for the political and material support that would later arrive through programs like Lend-Lease. Internally, the speech resolved the question that had divided the War Cabinet only weeks earlier. The option of negotiation, once seriously debated, disappeared from serious discussion. Churchill had not silenced dissent through force or authority alone. He had rendered it obsolete by committing the nation to a course from which retreat would mean moral collapse. This was a deliberate act. Churchill knew that leadership sometimes required closing doors permanently. By framing resistance as Britain's defining choice, he made compromise incompatible with national identity. That clarity allowed the government to focus on defense, production, and survival rather than internal argument. In a crisis where time and unity were everything, the speech functioned as a stabilizing anchor. Looking back, it is clear that the speech did not guarantee success. German air power remained formidable, and invasion plans were real. Britain survived the summer of 1940 through a combination of military performance, geographic advantage, and sheer endurance. But endurance itself was not automatic. It had to be cultivated. Churchill's speech prepared Britain psychologically to accept loss without surrender, isolation without despair, and danger without paralysis. It reframed suffering as purpose rather than punishment. In that sense, the speech was not simply rhetoric. It was preparation. It transformed fear into resolve before fear could dictate decisions. Britain's darkest hour did arrive, but when it did, the nation was already standing, already committed, and already unwilling to choose safety over survival. By the time the immediate threat of invasion began to recede, the deeper impact of Churchill's speech had already reshaped Britain's political and moral landscape. The nation had crossed a psychological threshold. Survival was no longer measured by safety or comfort, but by continuity. Britain had chosen to remain itself regardless of cost. This shift mattered profoundly. It meant that every subsequent hardship, from rationing and bombing to years of separation and loss, was endured within a framework of meaning. The speech had removed the question of whether Britain should continue fighting and replaced it with the certainty that it would. That certainty did not make the struggle easier, but it made it coherent. People could endure suffering when it served a clearly defined purpose. Churchill's words provided that purpose at the moment when confusion and fear threatened to fracture it. The speech also redefined leadership in wartime Britain. Churchill did not promise protection or quick victory. He promised honesty. That choice strengthened trust between government and people at a time when trust was fragile. Unlike propaganda that relies on exaggeration, Churchill's message derived its power from restraint. He acknowledged danger openly, which made his call for resistance credible rather than hollow. This approach proved decisive during the Blitz, when civilian morale became a central pillar of national defense. Bombs destroyed homes and neighborhoods, but they did not destroy belief. Britons had already been told that suffering was coming. When it arrived, it confirmed the truth of Churchill's words, rather than undermining them. The darkest hour speech thus functioned as a psychological inoculation against despair. Internationally, the consequences were equally significant. Britain's refusal to negotiate in 1940 altered the entire trajectory of the war. Had Britain sought peace, Germany would have consolidated control over Western Europe and redirected its full strength eastward without fear of a second front. The United States, lacking a committed ally, might have remained on the sidelines far longer. Churchill's speech signaled that Britain would remain a belligerent power regardless of isolation. This stance influenced American strategic thinking long before formal entry into the war. It framed Britain not as a defeated nation clinging to survival, but as a partner willing to bear the burden of resistance alone. That perception mattered when aid decisions were made and when long-term strategy was debated in Washington. In hindsight, the speech prepared Britain not just for its darkest hour, but for a prolonged war of endurance. It did not promise an end to suffering. It normalized it. That normalization was critical. Societies collapse not only under pressure, but under unmet expectations. Churchill ensured expectations were aligned with reality. By doing so, he reduced the psychological shock of continued hardship and preserved political stability during the most dangerous phase of the war. The speech stands as evidence that leadership under existential threat is not about inspiring hope alone, but about aligning a nation's understanding with the truth of its situation. Britain survived its darkest hour not because it believed victory was guaranteed, but because it had already accepted what survival would require. What distinguishes Churchill's approach is that he transformed vulnerability into resolve. By acknowledging the limits of Britain's power, he freed the nation from illusions that could have shattered morale later. This clarity allowed Britain to adapt, to innovate, and to endure. The Royal Air Force fought the Battle of Britain knowing it was the last line of defense. Civilians endured bombing knowing it was not temporary. Political leaders made hard choices knowing there was no alternative path waiting behind compromise. The speech did not make those burdens lighter, but it made them bearable by giving them meaning. In doing so, Churchill preserved Britain's ability to act rather than react at a moment when reaction alone would have led to collapse. The legacy of the speech also lies in how narrowly history turned. Had Britain chosen negotiation in 1940, the war's outcome would have been fundamentally altered. Germany would have secured its western flank, reshaped Europe, and forced future resistance into far more desperate conditions. Churchill's refusal to prepare the nation for peace, and his decision instead to prepare it for suffering, closed off that possibility. The speech was not simply a reflection of resolve, it was a point of no return. Once spoken, it committed Britain to a future defined by resistance, regardless of cost. That commitment altered the strategic landscape of the war and made later Allied victory conceivable. In the end, Churchill's speech prepared Britain for its darkest hour by stripping away false comfort and replacing it with purpose. It did not guarantee survival. It made survival worth choosing. That distinction explains why the speech continues to resonate long after the war itself has faded from living memory. It captures a truth about leadership that transcends its moment. When the stakes are absolute, leaders do not serve their people by promising safety. They serve them by telling the truth and trusting them to endure it. Britain's darkest hour passed not because danger disappeared, but because the nation had already been prepared to face it.